Dr. Shanthie Mariet D'Souza, and dear participants, welcome to joint webinar on NICE and month on Afghanistan and Afghanistan, the rocky road to peace. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy and a world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. Mantraya is also an independent research forum that seeks to make constructive contribution in the realm of strategy, innovation, and alternatives. It aims to create informed public debates through regular publication on subjects of national and international importance. It also serves as the platform for exchange of ideas and strategy involving scholars, researchers, academia, media, government, and non-government personnel, institutions. It also provides consultancy on different issues. To speak on this very important and interesting topic on Afghanistan, we have invited Dr. Shanthie Mariet D'Souza. Dr. D'Souza is a teacher in Defence and Strategic Studies, member of Research and Advisory Committee, Naval War College, Goa, board director of Regional Center of Strategic Studies, Colombo, research fellow at WeltTrends-Institut for International Politik, Potsdam, Germany, a board member of Small Wars Insurgencies, Routledge, UK, for the of Asian Security and International Affairs, stage expert and contributor on the Middle East Asia project at the Middle East Institute, Washington, DC, senior analyst for the South Asia desk with the Wikistat Analytic Community, and advisor for independent conflict research and analysis in London. She has previously been visiting research associate at the School of Business and Governance, Murdoch University, Australia, research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore, associate fellow at Institute of Defence Studies Analyses, New Delhi, Fulbright fellow and visiting research associate at South Asian Studies, the Paul H. School of Advanced International Studies on Hopkins University, Washington. Her research interests and expertise include counterterrorism, insurgencies, violent extremism, asymmetry and emerging security threats, armed conflict, illicit networks and organized crime, women, peace and conflict, prospects of long-term stabilization of Afghanistan, state and peace building in fragile states, security sector reforms, subnational governance and downward accountability in Afghanistan, international interventions, aid delivery and post-conflict stabilization, non-traditional security issues of South Asia, and many others. Dr. D'Souza, you have around 30 to 40 minutes to make initial remarks, and then we will open the floor for discussion. We request all our participants to drop questions in the Zoom room or under the Facebook Live. Dr. D'Souza, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Pramod. First of all, let me congratulate you for this initiative from Nepal to speak on a subject on Afghanistan. And given the fact that this is a joint webinar between Mantraya and Nitze, I think this is a good start, and it should be a harbinger for more debates on Afghanistan, particularly at a time when Afghanistan is going through a very crucial transition phase. Having said that, I would like to add a caveat that I'm speaking on Afghanistan, but not for Afghans or for any other country. I speak for myself. And given the fact that we have more than 400 registrations and we have seen quite a few questions already come in, I think more than 100, there's considerable interest in just scanning through those questions. I thought I'll just structure my talk to address most of these questions because we might not have much time for a Q&A. And I also like this discussion to be more interactive. So what I'm trying to do is in this topic, which I think is very important to understand from the basics of what really Afghanistan is going through at this point of time and what international community can do to help Afghanistan. I've structured the presentation in three parts. The first part, I look very briefly at the nature of the international intervention in Afghanistan, which started in 2001. So we are 18 years down the line looking at the international community's role, what it's done and what needs to be done to help Afghanistan stabilize. The second aspect of the presentation is look a little bit more detail on the transition process, which started in 2014, and take you briefly around the transformation decade from 2014 to 2024 on three key aspects inside Afghanistan, that is the security, the political, the economic and governance aspect. And the third, which is more important, is the way forward to understand how international community and regional countries can play an important role in stabilizing Afghanistan. And here again, I think I'll like to subdivide my presentation very briefly into looking at what Afghans can do for themselves, what the regional countries can do for Afghanistan, and what the international community at large needs to do in Afghanistan. So having laid out this broad contours of my presentation, I'll very briefly delve into the nature of the international intervention, because I think that's where the problem really lies, because it's been 18 years odd now, and many countries have been involved in Afghanistan, and still peace and stability remains elusive in that country. And why is that so? I think I would like to identify a few factors of how international community intervene in Afghanistan, and what were the factors that has led to this present state of affairs, which is more like a stalemate for the international community. The first is the nature of the military intervention. So if you remember, after the 9/11 attacks, US went into Afghanistan on a very militaristic approach of decimating the Taliban. And Operation Enduring Freedom was basically targeted towards the Taliban regime. They did manage to vanquish them in the sense of de-seating them from the powers in Kabul. But then these Taliban were able to move out of that country and find sanctuaries elsewhere. So the whole military approach towards decimating the group was not used in full strength for two reasons. One is Afghanistan didn't get the number of troops which was required for a counterinsurgency operation in the initial phases between 2001 and 3. Bush administration was more interested in moving out to Iraq. So during the golden period of stabilization between 2001 and 3, where things could have been worked favorably for Afghanistan, was lost because Americans diverted their attention towards Iraq. And thereafter, from 2003 onwards, we see on the security front, things started changing, and between 2005 and 6 we did see the re-emergence of Taliban from their sanctuaries, basically in the tribal areas along the borders of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And this re-emergence took a way that the Taliban were able to gradually gain ground, and the situation which is unfolding today is, you see media reports of a lot of area of Afghanistan under the Taliban control, and that again might be contested because there is a difference between Taliban influence and control, but there are territories which the Taliban are able to run their writ, and that's the state of affairs today. So what we saw on the military effort in the international community was, one, the lack of adequate troops, the second, lack of attention to Afghanistan, and third was a lack of unity of effort on the military combination between the US forces and the NATO. There were differences, there were caveats, there were national differences, there were red lines, and there were not many issues that you didn't have a coordinated, unified military effort in Afghanistan. The second and more important is, since most of the international community was involved and focused on the security-centered approach, the economic aspect was totally neglected. So there was many countries who gave aid to Afghanistan, but that aid never reached the people. And why did that occur? It basically occurred because the aid which was meant for the people was given through various other means rather than through the Afghans or through the Afghan budget. So there was this lack of trust between the capabilities of Afghans and the corruption levels in Afghanistan, and all of that, by which the international community thought that they could do quick projects in Afghanistan, demonstrate success, and move out of Afghanistan. So there were quite a few important projects in Afghanistan, of which I've done some work, which could have transformed Afghanistan to a normal functioning and a revenue generating state. But that didn't occur because most of the international projects were focused on quick impact projects. And thereafter, so these projects demonstrated success for a very limited period of time, say for 6 months, but they were not translated into something long term in terms of having an integrated business plan of how to link a particular project to the market, to the regional economy. That really didn't occur. And the third important aspect is, everyone was interested in demonstrated success, that they didn't think in long term of building institutions. So there were these efforts of starting initiatives and doing projects, but not much attention was given to institution building in Afghanistan. And thereby we see that gap today playing out in various fields. Now, coming specifically from talking about gaps in institutions, looking at the transition process itself, we need to understand that Afghanistan is going through a own critical phase of transition. Most of the narrative coming from Afghanistan has been pessimistic, and that's been the international media covering negative images or negative stories of levels of violence in Afghanistan, but have not actually focused on what Afghanistan has achieved in this last 18 years. And that is important, because if we don't focus on that, then the fragile gains which Afghanistan has achieved thus far will be simply lost. And therein lies the danger. Now, if you look at the security arena or the security sphere in Afghanistan, we do hear a lot of media reports of Taliban insurgency taking on a lot of posts and control over territories. But there are also Afghan forces who are capable of withstanding those and repelling some of those. So in the security arena, there has been success stories of Afghan National Army and the Afghan National Police. But what I feel could have been done better was in terms of building more of policing and community policing strategies, which would have helped Afghans in their day-to-day security. So again, the international community was more focused on an army which was trained to be on conventional lines, when you're actually fighting a very unconventional and asymmetric war, and for which the police was very critical. So there, I think there's a gap which Afghanistan and the international community can bridge at this point of time. The second is the political dimensions, and here again we have these problems of institutions and procedures and mechanisms being elections, and most of the elections are always contested. That creates a kind of crisis for the government of the day, because when you're looking at Afghanistan, you are looking at an experiment of having a democracy out there. So the Western notion of democracy has not really picked roots, but there is democracy in Afghanistan, and Afghans do want democracy. So when they come out to vote and they risk their lives, they are not able to get those results known, because most of the time these election processes have been contested, and I've been in the election observation missions and I've seen the problems there. It doesn't need rocket science, it just needs some will to put those institutions in place and those mechanisms in place, and to be prepared for this kind of eventualities. So what you have at the end of all this process, money and efforts going into the elections, is your results are always contested. So for instance, in 2014, you had an experiment which was put together by the Americans. The Secretary of State, John Kerry, put together a national unity government, and they were divided between two camps. So that divisions have played on the political aspects of that country, and which I think needs to be carefully dealt with, because if as Afghanistan transitions and builds on those institutions of democracy, of elections, of parliament, and the legitimacy of the Afghan government is critical. And that is more important now, because Afghanistan is actually going through a peace process. And again, the peace process is not from within Afghanistan. It was externally mediated peace deal. A peace deal which was signed in Doha between US and the Taliban, and the Afghan government was excluded for most part of it. It was only towards the end that this deal was presented to them and told them that you have these terms and you have to do them. So today what we do see with the Afghan government is there are issues, and the issues are basically on how do you negotiate with a group which had signed a deal outside, which is outside the country and carrying out violent activities inside the country. For instance, you've seen the violence level has peaked, and it has been barbarous acts of violence. You've heard the news about this attack on the maternity hospital in Kabul. A lot of innocent lives have been lost by this kind of groups, which are still using violence, have not given up on violence, when they're actually signed a peace deal. So how do you build trust among the Afghans and the Afghan government that this group is serious to give up on violence? Because if you look normally at any of this peace process, negotiations occur only after ceasefire is announced or adhered to. But here, there has been no ceasefire. All through in a hurry to have a peace deal. those goalposts have been shifting, and those red lines have become blurred. And what are these red lines we are talking about? We are talking about the women in Afghanistan. We are talking about the youth in Afghanistan. We are talking of those normal citizens who are actually bearing the brunt of this insurgency and violence. And they don't. And if you ever hear people Afghans saying that they are ready for the peace process, it's because there's a fatigue which has developed. They know that tomorrow the Americans will leave, or any other country will just leave them and go the way they did that in 1990s. And where do they go from here? So there is that fear and distrust which has propelled the Afghans that, okay, let's move ahead with the peace because nothing else is occurring, and the Taliban will continue with its violence and we are going to lose lives. And there's no future for this country. So there is that war fatigue which has propelled. But when you look at the other issue of bringing the Afghans together on a peace process, the Intra-Afghan Dialogue just hasn't really taken off the way it should have, because there are differences within Afghans, and that about the peace process, about how should it be done, what are the terms on which you should negotiate with the Taliban, and if the Taliban have to come back in some form, what would be that form? Would it be a change in the nature of the political system, that you give up completely on democracy? Is it a choice between an Islamic Republic or an emirate? Would you actually, the Taliban would want to change the constitution? What would that mean in terms of the rights of the women, the minority and the youth? And all of these questions remain unanswered. So there is this problem of this peace process, which actually was being an externally mediated peace deal in Doha, not in Kabul. And it has been on a timing based on the American timeline, not on Afghan timeline. You can't rush through a peace process or a peace deal in 6 months' time or 1 year's time and expect the deal to be implemented and accepted by everybody. So therein, I think there is this huge problem of in the political arena. Now, the third is, again, very critical in understanding why Afghanistan, which was a functioning state, has turned to be what it is. What you hear from Afghanistan in terms of economics is mostly about the drug production, about the grey economy, the smuggling, and all of it, which is what is occurring in the informal sector. There's no formal economy which has been built. And here, I think Afghanistan has not been given that platform to build on its agricultural base, its mineral base, its energy base, and thereby the opportunities by which Afghanistan could have generated its own revenue has been lost. And with the result today, Afghanistan still continues to depend on international aid. Any talk of cutting down of aid leads to a lot of tensions inside Afghanistan, because they do need money, but no one has really worked on how to make Afghanistan self-sufficient by itself. And it's for the Afghans to decide how they want to take the economy forward, because they sit at a very important position in Asia. They're at the crossroads of Asia. They're also known as the heart of Asia. And you hear a lot of things about these conferences where you have Heart of Asia conference and the RECA process and all of this, which are good. But the thing is that these things have not been actualized. And the problem is, if you don't actualize it now, then opportunity of stabilizing Afghanistan is going to be simply lost. Because without a self-sufficient, independent economy, Afghanistan will not be able to sustain itself on the long term. And therein, I think the international community has to pay more attention. Coming to the way forward, which again I'll talk to you very briefly about. One is to look at what can be done inside Afghanistan by the Afghans themselves. I think one is to put the act together in terms of their security, the political and the economic aspects. Afghans are very capable, they are very dedicated, and they do look at the whole notion of Afghaniyat very seriously, and they are a united country despite the fact that others have tried to divide them. So I think they have that inherent strength of being united in their own way, but they need a vision and they need the leadership. Two, one, build trust among themselves when they are going ahead with the intra-Afghan dialogue. Have a reconciliation at a national level. Second is have a unified strategy of integrating all the provinces in terms of the economic and the governance aspect of it. And thirdly, in terms of security, I think Afghanistan needs to do more in terms of policing. Now, if you look at the regional countries' role, I think this has been more problematic. And the tragedy of Afghanistan is that time and again, its internal contradiction has been used by external powers. And thereby, you have every country around in Afghanistan's neighborhood involved in some way or the other. It could be positive and negative. And unfortunately, mostly it has been negative and to the detriment of the stability and functioning of Afghanistan. So if you look at countries like, I don't want to name particular countries because I'm sure this will come in Q&A, it has been mostly as negative involvement in that country, because there has been the geopolitics by which certain countries and certain regional alignments have benefited by instability in Afghanistan. And we need to move away from that because, for one, I think we need to understand that whatever happens in Afghanistan in terms of a negative security scenario has implications for the region, for all the neighbors, and of course the international community. The Taliban insurgency itself, if you look at it, is not a very united force now. It has various factions. So every country is trying to use it in its own way. But more importantly, there's one country which has those elements based in their cities. And I think that should be given up on, because if those sanctuaries are used and if the Taliban have to continue the activity, given their linkages with international terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, I think the countries will have more problems to deal with. And there will be a conflict spillover, because it's now just not restricted between Taliban and Al-Qaeda. There's also IS present. And so there'll be more of this mushrooming of international terrorist groups, and they will expand areas of activity in Afghanistan and beyond. And that, I think, should be an area of concern for the regional countries. Secondly, I think in terms of looking at regional involvement, there has been too much of focus on a narrative of pessimism, and most of these countries have failed to look at Afghanistan as an opportunity to benefit from and to help Afghanistan by itself. So if you look at the regional cooperation mechanisms which have been there, like for instance, there is SARC, there's SCO, and the various platforms, no one has really looked at using Afghanistan as a land bridge by which trade, transit, energy pipelines like TAPI, electric supply lines like CASA 1000 and all of that could have benefited these countries. So one way to move away from this competitive nature of the regional countries there is to actually look at regional economic projects and connectivity issues which would bind these countries together and minimize the competition. TAPI was one such initiative which is stuck somewhere because of so many issues. But the fact is that TAPI could have been a pipeline which could have unified this conflicting countries in a mutually dependent framework. And that would have generated considerable revenue for Afghanistan. And at the same time, it would have minimized competition between countries. And lastly, if you look at the international community's role, again, I think there has to be a unified, coordinated approach of involving Afghanistan in various ways and means. I think one, you need to understand that Afghans have the capability. They just need to be in charge of their own affairs. So when we talk about the peace process, we hear words like those Afghan-owned, Afghan-led, Afghan-controlled processes, but actually the Afghans are not in charge. So I think for Afghans to solve their country's problem, we need to put Afghanistan at the centers and give Afghans the lead position on taking matters in their own hand. This has happened for long, but in the sense of, you've heard jargons of this sort, but it's not been really implemented. And in addition to that, I think there needs to be a kind of accountability measures of how Afghanistan progresses in terms of security, in terms of the political institution building, in terms of having elections and the peace process, and having mechanisms inside the country to deal with their own problems, own ways of conflict resolution. There are a lot of myths about Afghanistan, which I think I would like to debunk maybe in the Q&A. But the fact is that Afghanistan of today is very different from what it was in the 1990s. So even what you thought about it in terms of the tribal polity and all of that, most of it is transformed. Afghanistan has seen that transition. It's going through a very critical period, and I don't think we should close that window of opportunity now. But we need to make use of that space. And that space is, though it's shrinking, it's available. So the time is now of how you will intervene in a particular sector to make things which will have long-term implications for Afghanistan and the region. So my submission is that beyond looking at a very negative or a very short-term intervention in Afghanistan, we need to look at Afghanistan and help Afghanistan build itself, rebuild itself the way it was before conflict hit that country 4 decades back. So to broadly sum up, I think, and to leave more space for the Q&A, which are quite a few, I would like to emphasize on the fact that Afghanistan is going through its transition process, and there are areas of opportunities by which the international community and the regional countries can contribute. But more importantly, it is necessary for Afghans to be in lead. So having said that, I'd like to stop there because I see a number of questions, and I'm afraid we won't have time for such an important, interesting discussion if I just keep going on with this monologue. Thank you. Thanks, Pramod. I'd like to take some questions from you.
Thank you, Dr. D'Souza. It was very enlightening presentation. Let me rush to the questions because there are lots of questions, as you have seen the questions. Let me.
And it's pouring out.
Let me put
it's pouring in terms of rain and questions.
Yes. So maybe we can club in a set of 3 questions so that on the basis of themes. First is that what is the future trajectory if talk collapse? Like what will happen in Afghanistan if the talk collapse? Second is what is the status of intra-Afghan dialogue? And third is what role can SAARC play for bringing perpetual peace in Afghanistan? These are the first 3 set of questions.
Right. I think future trajectory of peace talks is important because if the peace talks do not take off and there are issues with that, I think we'll see the continuation of a present stalemate. But on the contrary, if this peace talks were to take place, on what grounds do they take place? You have the violence levels which are peaking. You do still have the Taliban with linkages to international terrorist group. The Taliban have not reneged on any of its commitments to these groups.
The trajectory of the peace talks itself, I think there is a problem here because there are differences at various levels which are forward. It could be Afghan initiative. For instance, Afghanistan has its own conflict resolution mechanisms, and they had set up a high peace council to deal with negotiations and reintegration and reconciliation with the Taliban. And that could be a venue which need to be reworked on and which could have been a useful point off and on. These talks is that one is that the Taliban itself is not united. There are various, I mean, this is not the Taliban of 1990s. There are multiple factions and groups within that. And the more problematic ones are like the Haqqani network, which we don't know whether they are serious about, even if you have outside the country violence activities. So that has to be factored in. And secondly, it's also about giving Afghanistan the time and space to have its government reach out to the Taliban on its terms and negotiate from a position of strength. You can't, Afghan government, we did have people who have left insurgency and joined back the political force. For instance, in India, there was one case in Mizoram where the groups which had given up on violence came back to the political sphere. So if that is the possibility, if Taliban comes on its constitution, tries to change the nature of the polity and the society, that itself might be problematic for Afghanistan in the long term because there will be rejection from inside Afghanistan on this count. That leads to the second question on the intra-Afghan dialogue. I think there are various attempts being made, and it's heartening to see that Afghan women have been in. And if they ever have a dialogue, it has to be on the condition of a ceasefire, which Taliban is not ready to give. In the face of violence, how do you talk about peace? How do you convince other minorities and other groups that the Taliban are serious about peace? how do you balance the rest of the issue with the now coming to coming to the fact of looking at SAARC per se, it's mostly been dysfunctional for various reasons, but I think having Afghanistan inside SAARC is a plus. It's definitely a positive benefit for Afghanistan, because Afghanistan will stand to gain from derive the benefit. There are various mechanisms. For instance, if we look at SAARC beyond the politics of bilateral issues between countries, there's also mechanisms of disaster management, health emergencies, humanitarian interventions, and that I think could have been used for Afghanistan, because it would have Afghanistan deal with that. And SAARC would have a very important role in terms of reviving the economy, in terms of the building up more of trade and transit facilitation issues, and connecting that agrarian economy so that it moves away from poppy cultivation to having the agrarian base it had, basically the wheat and other such products, fruits. Afghanistan was greatly benefited if it had used all those regional mechanisms to get out of the zero-sum competition between countries.
Let me move to the second round of questions. It's like the role of India, China, and US. First is, what is the future of Afghanistan-India relations after the US withdrawal? What will be security implication on India after the withdrawal? Second is on China. What is the role of China in Afghanistan at present? And what will be their role after the withdrawal? And third is on US. What will be the impact of upcoming US election on the intra-Afghanistan settlement?
So in terms of role of India, India's played a role of actually helping stabilize through its infrastructure development projects, that it has accrued tremendous amount of goodwill inside Afghanistan. So there is a huge constancy within Afghanistan, which looks very favorably towards India's role inside Afghanistan, and they would like India to continue that role. But there are concerns inside the country at times in the peace talks and all that. And the Afghan government initiatives will be supported by the government of India. So whatever trajectory Afghanistan goes through, be it in terms of the peace talks or be it in terms of the security transition, India's position has been to support the Afghan-led government. The second aspect, which played a very interesting role, most of it, so it was involved in the mess iron and copper fields and also some energy pipelines. But then it ran into issues. China has had direct contacts with the Taliban. It has a good relationship with Pakistan. So on the security aspect, Afghanistan would impact its vested interest in that country. But over time, there has been a little bit of concern about how things are evolving. So they also are involved with the training of the troops in Afghanistan. The interesting development has been between India and Afghanistan, where after the Wuhan summoned the scenario in the last 2 months, so we don't know whether India and China will work together, but China has certain interests and it has sustained that interest. So US troop withdrawal will not mean that China will step in more into Afghanistan, but will manage or outsource its situation, its interest, in managing its interest to other countries. So direct involvement. Has been the first country to sign the strategic partnership agreement with Afghanistan, even before the US. And likewise, Afghanistan.
3 questions for this set of questions. First is, would China leverage in Afghanistan to help them in containing separatist movement in Xinjiang? Will China use it as an opportunity to fight Xinjiang separatists? Second is, given the Afghanistan history of the last 50 years, how long will this process sustain? And third is, what is the role of SCO? What role can SCO play in present situation?
I think China has the concerns of its restive province of Xinjiang coming under the extremist influence and has taken own initiatives. At one level, they do have some kind of contacts with the Taliban group, that kind of, to make sure that these extremism doesn't spill over and affect the restive province of Xinjiang. The second is also about the fact that they are in good contacts with Pakistan and they have some kind of security assurances on that count. So I think China is more or less providing a to this country. Now coming to SEO, again, I think this is a very important forum because you have these main countries in the region, that is China, Russia, involved there, and India and Pakistan also there. So I think SCO will be an interesting forum in terms of conflict resolution, because the differences which are laid out by different countries is to bring China to having some kind of agreement between these two and other countries in the region in terms of non-interference in Afghanistan. And corollary aspect of this could also be on the economic count of how having SCO play a more important role, just not organization to help Afghanistan derive benefits from it.
Okay, let me go to the next round of questions. What is the present situation of women in Afghanistan? What role do Afghan women play in the peace process? The second question is, what role India plays in Afghanistan? Why India is not ready to perform any crucial role in Afghanistan, especially after the current US-Taliban peace deal? Third is there possibility of non-state actors to form government in Afghanistan? If so, what would be the future balancing in Asian geopolitics, provided that India probably would never negotiate with the terrorist organizations?
If we look at the situation of women in Afghanistan, many girl children who are enrolled in schools, and there's been a positive development in the fact that you have a lot many young women in the parliament today, and that I think it has the highest proportion in South Asia. So I see that as a positive development of the last 80 years. And you also see this women champions civil society organizations. Because for one, I think there are few women groups in Afghanistan during my course of work of more than a decade. And what is always fascinating to see is that how brave and how determined they are to make sure that Afghanistan doesn't go back to what it was in the 1990s or doesn't go back to what it was during the Taliban era. So you do have who have come out and spoken about. We increasingly see that some women voices are being heard and some women issues are being represented. Now, the whole question is, in these 18 years, we did see some progress in terms of women's rights. And there is a fear that if the Taliban come back, there would be a regression of rights and those achievements. So women have come to the forefront, and one of those initiatives which you see is on the social media platform. It's called My Red Line. So there are women who have taken on to various platforms, be it in terms of radio, be it in terms of the social media, be it in terms of being in the parliament, or even being in the dialogue with the Taliban. You have people, women there, actually who are opposed to sitting with the Taliban now, talking to them. So, and as for the Taliban, you do see a kind of a change in terms of, engaging the women. But what we need to watch with caution is whether this is tactical or whether there has been a real attitudinal change. And my few interactions with them, it's very difficult to discern whether really they think that women should be let to do what they're doing, because these were once upon a time who wouldn't even let women leave their house, wear what they want to do, wear and do what they want to do. So we have to be a little watch with little caution, and we need to increase women's role in terms of substantial representation of their rights, and their participation has to be based on a certain level of provincial representation. For instance, I've worked with the provincial councils in Afghanistan, and there are many women provincial councils who do a lot of grassroots level work. And they could represent the women more importantly in terms of what the women in Afghanistan really want. So one, you have women representing issues at Kabul, but there are also women representing issues at the provincial level, and that needs to be integrated. And their voices need to be heard. So what I'm happy today is actually to see women come out and speak and get themselves involved rather than stay out of the process. And we need to enlarge that platform and expand that canvas gradually so that more women are there, just not as representative, but as someone who want to make substantial change to the peace process itself. Because ultimately, women's rights issue is not a special category by itself as the West would see it. It's also a human rights issues. And we did have discussions on this in the previous webinars. And most fascinating aspect is women issues are not precluded from the larger human rights issues. So women have a critical role, and that role needs to be expanded. And it has to be done in terms of getting certain concrete representation and issues on board. Now, looking at India's role in Afghanistan, talk about how India has helped Afghanistan in terms of its capacity building and infrastructure development. And when it comes to peace talks, it's in for Afghans to take their own time and go through the own process of finding peace for themselves. No country can trust peace on Afghanistan. It is for them to find it. And there are ways and means. I mean, Afghanistan has this huge history of conflict resolution mechanisms and their own way of doing it, the Afghan way of doing it. So India's role has been to sit back and watch at the moment. But given a scenario where India has to intervene or is called to intervene by the Afghans, then I'm sure that India will reach out to the Afghans. Now, the third question.
Now, let me go to the next round of question. It's more with the internal politics. Like, please tell us more about power sharing between Abdullah and Ghani. What is the status of political alignment from non-Pashtun region? Second is, what are policies adopted by Afghanistan to lead in a path to democracy, whatever there's like accepted notion of democracy is. Third is, do you think Afghanistan democracy will survive without any help from the foreign troops?
Interesting questions. I think what we see, the idea of democracy in Afghanistan is more an issue of looking at it through a Western or a prism. Afghanistan had its own experiments in democracy in the 1960s, and they have their own institutions which are very democratic in their own way. So I think to understand Afghanistan democratic transition, we should understand that it will take time for this traditional mechanisms and institutions in place, for instance, the shuras and jirgas. And the best way forward would be to actually have a hybrid between those traditional and the modern institutions. Because 18 years of this democratic experience in Afghanistan, there are some institutions which are centralization, particularly when it comes to financial aspects at the provincial levels. I think that needs to be looked at. But when it comes to democracy, the notion itself is not alien. It's just that most of the Afghans have gone through 3 elections now and they know the process. It's just that the faith in those processes and the institutions need to be rebuilt. Because you can't go to elections and then have the results not announced and then have contested elections, which actually doesn't work well for the democracy in Afghanistan. So what the international community has to take care of is have free and fair elections and make sure that those processes and systems are put much before in place before the elections, rather than wait for elections which get into a spin and then you have this contested elections playing havoc in terms of the political system. And that you see with the power sharing arrangement between Abdullah and Ghani, because you had seen it in the last term from 2014, that there was this national unity government and there were 2 camps which are very diverse in their views. And it's very difficult to get things going when there is division between the 2 camps. So what you need for Afghanistan is to come together in terms of having a unified system. Maybe Afghanistan could move into more of a parliamentary system, could have more political parties representing their rights and their aspirations. Maybe it's time to rework on the Afghan political system if this system is turning out to be not very useful for them.
Let me go to another round of questions. What are the damage caused by the United States in Afghanistan? Your comment on that. Second, if Taliban comes to power, will India have to vacate from Afghanistan, or it will sustain its role over there? Third is, after failed attempt of China for a peace deal in Afghanistan, whether China will again try to involve in peace deal, as there are less chances that US peace deal will give any positive results.
Fascinating questions. And so the damage caused by the US to Afghanistan, well, I think US has played an important role in terms of having the Taliban out from power in 2001 and today having a democratic government in Kabul, however imperfect it is. So the damage per se of US is, it's not very easy to define in terms of, just pointing out to those areas where the US has not made contribution. US has made tremendous contribution in terms of blood and treasure. They've lost quite a number of soldiers, invested a lot of money. What US has not been able to do is act much in advance in terms of having free and fair elections, giving Afghans a chance to express and have their own choice in terms of the political leadership. And thirdly, I think, which is more important in terms of economy of Afghanistan, so that it becomes an independent revenue generating and is not a aid dependent country, and it moves away from the dependency. It's more important that US should have involved more in terms of building that revenue base and the agricultural base, which we don't see because most of the US attention was on the security aspect of it. It was a very short-term, quick intervention war during the Bush administration. And there was a lot of this civilian and military divide in Afghanistan or in the US or over Afghanistan, sorry. And that difference is played out to a kind of strategy which was not very coherent and not very unified, which actually led to this negative implications for Afghanistan. So if there was a unified strategy that US troops and US presence would be for this period of time, and in this period of time, these are the benchmarks we would achieve in terms of the security, the political and economic aspects, I think there would have been much more concrete results for the US, and it would have been more useful for Afghanistan to know that they would get the aid depending on achieving those certain benchmarks or certain targets. So US has played an important role. At times, it's not been very useful, which is not debatable. There are also arguments that if US has to withdraw totally tomorrow, whether Afghanistan will do well, I think it would. It depends on how they leave Afghanistan at this point of time, because Afghans are capable of handling their own affairs. It's just a matter of building on that capability. If Taliban have to come to power, how India will deal with it? I think India has dealt with a lot of regimes in the neighborhood as they are. India has not taken any principled position of only dealing with certain political dispensations. We've seen in when it came to the military leadership in Pakistan, the military in Myanmar, or the Maoists in Nepal. So, I mean, India has not taken a position of that sort and never will, because I think for every country's national security interest, it depends on how do you engage that country, or how do you engage those powers to be. And if Taliban have to come back to power, India will deal with it likewise. And there have been quite a few overtures done by Taliban towards India. It is for India to pick it up and work on it. But my sense is that India would back and stand by a democratic government in Kabul and work with it, and will work towards preventing any slide of that democratic government unless things go dramatically and drastically wrong. So India would stand by the Afghan government of the day. China and peace talks. Yeah, China has also, I think I mentioned in the presentation before that China has made this numerous overtures towards Taliban, and there have been various attempts of doing this own unilateral peace processes. They will continue with that, and I think they will try, because they do have that kind of linkages. For instance, they do have their economic interest to take care of. They also have huge security concerns. So China will play an important role in the peace talks and will make its own moves. But that necessarily may not be in terms of regional or an international community approach. I think my sense is that China will go more unilateral and secure its interests, and will not bother about the regional implications of the peace talks.
We almost come towards the end of the program, so let us put the last set of questions. How do we see the role of Russia at present, and how will they engage in Afghanistan post with US withdrawal? Second is, what are the major factors for Afghanistan's transition to peace? Third question is, for every person in Afghanistan, peace is a dream. In what ways global agency can provide support to marginalized groups, Afghanistan, women, children, and economic deprived groups? That is third. And fourth question is, what are the basic principles and determinants of Afghanistan foreign policy in general and particular while dealing with great powers?
Well, Russia has an interesting and now is carving out an important role for itself, I think, in preparations for the US withdrawal. I mean, we did see reports for more than a year plus about Russia making outreach to the Taliban in various forms. And there are reports that Russia had kept contacts, had supplied equipment and funding to the Taliban. And that, I think, is more a function of the zero-sum game which has been played out between the great powers, that is, between Russia and US. Over time, Russia has made that outreach, given the fact that there are concerns that the IS presence in Afghanistan has been targeted towards them, and therefore, corollary, by reaching out to the Taliban, they can neutralize and make some gains from that. So Russia, in its own sphere, has been making that connections with the Taliban. So have countries like China and Iran, in a way of preparing for a US drawdown or a complete troop withdrawal. So, and that sphere has been used by Russia pretty well. Likewise, Russia has also been involved in the peace processes, which you must be aware of, and they have taken up the Taliban agenda at various forums. And that's surprising because at one point of time they were arch enemies, and today they seem to be friends on issues because of the great power competition which is evolving in Afghanistan. I think since they are mostly dependent on the countries, the great powers, there has been no concrete policy per se, but they have been involving the great power. And we know that from the early 19th century, when the new got intensified in Afghanistan, that great game continues till today. And that great game only gets newer, with newer actors getting involved in Afghanistan. So the foreign policy of Afghanistan per se looks at deriving benefit of this great power competition, and it has tried through various mechanisms like the Heart of Asia, the Rika Conference, of getting these great powers to help them on economic terms. Unfortunately, they have not been able to make much success out of it. Issues of women and children, I think Afghanistan here, there are various platforms available. One, as I mentioned, was SARC, and then you have the SEO. But you also have the UN, which could actually take on a more important role when it comes to representing these rights and protecting the gains of the last 18 years. And UN has taken certain initiatives, but I think they should make more important contribution to that. Now, looking at the Afghanistan transition to peace, my sense is that it has to be a gradual process, and it has to be a comprehensive process. It cannot be a piecemeal process. When you're talking of an Afghan peace process, it doesn't mean you have Afghanistan in pieces. Rather, you mean you have Afghanistan together and you have the peace and stability which Afghans require. So the transition process itself will take time. If you look at any of the case studies of peace processes, be it from Colombia to any of these countries, everyone needs that time. And there is the entire literature on peace building which says that the timing is very important. The timing is important in terms of the ripeness of the talks. Is it the right time to talk to the Taliban? If you're going to talk to the Taliban, are you talking from a position of strength? If not, then why are you talking? Because it's going to lead to a situation where you will have a further stalemate, if not a negative scenario in terms of the violence levels. So Afghanistan's transition to peace has to be a gradual process. It has to be comprehensive. It has to start at a very grassroots level, and there are a lot of peace initiatives which are actually very diverse and disjointed, which need to be unified from, say, the provincial level to the national level, and then have that unified voices represented through a mechanism in Kabul, that says that all the Afghans have come together on a platform, and these are the terms and conditions on which Afghans will negotiate with the Taliban. For instance, cessation of violence, protection of rights, constitutional rights being retained, the gains made in the last 18 years being preserved in certain form. So I think it's important at this point of time that as Afghanistan transitions to peace and to a stable country, that these points come more clearly in terms of understanding what it is at the local level, what is it at the national level, and then looking at it more in terms of the regional and international level, not the other way around.